Good morning. Thank you for coming. My name is Sean Donnelly. I'm the chair of the Democrats of the Kennebunkport in Arundel. Welcome to the second of our town forum series that we're doing this year, discussing issues that are facing our community, hearing from the community how it's affecting you and the people you know, and listening to our elected officials and local officials who are working on these issues. So today we're going to be focusing on the issue of the housing crisis, the shortage of housing, and the number of folks in our community who are facing difficulty finding access to homes in our three towns. We're going to open with some brief introductions and explanations from our guests here. We're hosted by Representative Tracy Geer, and then we're going to open it up to questions as well. So I just want to thank you all again very much for attending, and Tracy, I'll pass the mic to you.
Thanks so much, Sean. And careful. It's great to see everyone here this morning and to see so many folks come out to talk and discuss more about the housing crisis that we face. My name is Tracy Geer. I am the representative for District 134, which is Kennebunkport and coastal Biddeford and Kennebunk, what I like to call the coast with the most. And it's my honor to represent many of you in the Maine legislature. I am also the House Chair of the Joint Select Committee on Housing. So we created a special select committee, and our leadership in the legislature had the foresight to do that so that we can really focus on the housing crisis that we face. I also serve on the Labor and Housing Committee, which is the standing committee that primarily now focuses on labor issues. So it's great to be here this morning. And we do want to have a conversation. So you can see we're sitting here and we want to take the opportunity to really hear from you all today as we discuss this issue. So please, we're going to, as Sean describes, we're going to have some comments from our guests, and then we are also going to open up the floor for questions. And I think this is just the start. You know, housing is a big issue. It is quite endemic, not just here in Maine, but across the country. We are not alone in facing this challenge. So, you know, I think we're just going to be, you know, starting, and we will continue to be focused on this as we move forward. So I want to take a minute and introduce our guests on the panel. First, we have Karen Winton, and Karen is the Deputy Director of Community Development for the town of Kennebunk, and I'll pass the mic to Karen to talk a little bit more about what she does.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. This is not my comfort zone, speaking into a microphone, but I'm going to go ahead and go with it. My name is Karen Winton. I work for the town of Kennebunk and have for about the last 10 years full-time. My current position finds me housed in our Community Development Department, which encompasses code enforcement, planning, engineering, and also social services, which actually pairs really nicely and brings a perspective that I think is really important to have in an office like that when you're talking about especially issues like housing. And when you have that social services perspective there, it can influence things in a really positive way. So part of what I do is managing social services for the town, which includes administering a general assistance program. If you're not familiar with that, that is a state program. Every town and city in the state of Maine must have a general assistance program and administer that. And it is a program of financial aid for those who cannot meet their most basic needs. You have to qualify based on various eligibility terms, and it's sometimes referred to as a program of last resort. It doesn't go anywhere close to capturing how to support a household in a very broad sense, but it can be a stopgap in terms of emergencies and very short-term assistance. So through that work, I do encounter a lot of individuals in very dark times and very desperate times, but also you encounter individuals looking for supports that that program may not need. So that finds me offering resources and referrals to our community and several of our community partners which exist, and we're so thankful they exist because they can provide a yes or a support to people who do have legitimate needs and need supports in the community. And one of those, look at this segue, is York County Community Action. So
And we also, that's great. That was a great segue. And yeah, we also have with us Carter Friend, who's the executive director of York County Community Action.
Thank you very much, Representative Deere, and thank you for including me today. So I'm Carter Friend. I'm the executive director of York County Community Action. Can I ask how many folks have heard of our organization, York County Community Action? That's good. A lot of hands in the room. So we provide a broad range of social services throughout the county. And so that includes everything from Head Start and WIC to transportation to several programs I'll talk about in more detail related to housing and energy services. We also are a federally qualified health center, which means we provide primary health care and behavioral health care and dental care to over 9,000 patients a year. Many of our clients are folks that are struggling to make ends meet. And these can be folks that might be struggling to make ends meet because they're on a fixed income. So many of our seniors are folks that may have disability, and their incomes are not going to change. And so our role is to help them stretch those dollars as far as they can stretch them in order to make ends meet. And in this particular case, in order to continue to pay rent or remain housed. Many of our folks are folks who may be experiencing a temporary crisis. These may be folks who have generally are able to make ends meet and are achieving well-being, but they may have hit a bump in the road. They may be experiencing unemployment for a long time now related to COVID or otherwise. They may have high medical costs that they weren't anticipating. And so those are folks that need some sort of temporary assistance from us in order to get back on their feet. And then we're also working with many folks who maybe have experienced generational poverty, who are striving to achieve economic well-being, and we're helping them support their journey to do that by providing them with the tools and the support they need to achieve economic well-being. All of those folks, and we'll talk about this in a minute, all of those folks are experiencing this problem of trying to find affordable housing. Does anyone watch the Academy Awards? So what's the title of the movie that just won the Best Picture? Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. That is our affordable housing crisis. And so we will talk more about that.
I'm gonna borrow that description because that really is the challenge. And just briefly, as we get started, I did want to just ground everyone in what I call the 4-point story of why we're here, because I think we all, have our own situations that we're dealing with, and it's sometimes hard to see why we're in this pickle, as I call it. We're in a pickle, and it goes back to the 1980s. In the 1980s, HUD stopped building housing across the country. We used to have HUD, they used to be called housing projects, right? Stopped building and managing those, and replaced it instead with a tax credit program to encourage the production of affordable housing for people with low incomes. And that has not happened enough. In Maine alone, we are short 20,000 units of affordable housing, meaning housing that's affordable by people who make less than 50% of the area median income. 20,000 units. So, and that's just accumulated over the years of housing we have not produced. We also, at the time, took an important step of deinstitutionalizing folks that were in mental health institutions, with the intention at the time to replace that with community-based mental health care. We did step 1, we never did step 2. So we have many people in our country who are experiencing severe and persistent mental illness, who cannot take care of themselves, and in many cases, some folks I met yesterday spent 30 years living in a tent in the woods somewhere. And that's reality. That's not a political statement. That is the reality of many folks, and the need to address that problem is before us in a big way right now. We also, over the years, have, in the interest of different kinds of things, we have created zoning and land use policies that restrict certain types of housing to certain places in a serious way. And easiest example to call it is single-family homes. Different size lots in different communities. You can only build this one kind of housing, and that is something that we need to think about as we think about all of the different things that interact. We're thinking about climate change, and we're thinking about how the different types of housing that people might need as they go through their lives. Big conversation there, but the issue here is zoning has created a certain type of housing stock that we have that does not meet the needs that we have as people. And then finally, I would argue I will say this is a personal comment, but in Maine specifically, we are folks who love the outdoors. We are people who love green space. We live in Maine because we love that. That is a big reason why a lot of us are here. In Maine, we have focused historically on preserving land for agriculture and forestry and conservation, all of which are super important, and absolutely, I think as a state, we are committed to that. We have never strategically included where are the people going to live. We've left that all very much figure it out. And we have been very fortunate over the years because we've had enough housing, so it hasn't been an issue. Now what we see is because of the accumulation of all those things I talked about, we do not have enough housing. The 20,000 units I mentioned, that's just affordable housing. That's not workforce/middle income housing for our kids who might want to be able to buy a house in Maine someday, or someone who would be hired by one of our hospitals to come and work, who they turn down the jobs because they do not have a place to live that they can afford with a very good salary. So those four things are some of the key reasons why, again, we're in this pickle. And so I just wanted to ground everyone in that, because what we're going to focus on today is the way that we've also structured our work in the Select Committee on Housing, which is phase one is to think about the urgent emergency situations that people are in. Phase two is to think about how we, what I call rescue affordable housing. So where it exists, let's not lose it and produce more of affordable housing. That's bucket two. I call them bucket. And then the third part is the structural and systemic issues that we face that we need to tackle at the state and local levels to say, how do we plan for this better moving forward so we aren't talking about being in the same pickle 10 years from now. So all of that said, just wanted to ground everyone in how we got here and the challenges in front of us. Today, we're here with some local folks who are in the trenches every day working on these issues. And they're going to help us understand what is happening locally and what we face locally when we look at that urgent emergency situation. So the first question I was going to pose to our panelists is, how is the housing situation impacting us here locally, and what have you seen change in the work that you do with folks that is impacting their ability to live healthy, full, and productive lives? And I'll pass it first to Karen.
Great, thank you. What's interesting for me is having worked for the town for 10 years, when I first started in my role administering the General Assistance Program and working in social services, we had a variety of different options for people for housing. Now, there weren't many and they weren't great, but they did exist, where there would be individuals in our community who shared housing, lived in a room with a shared bathroom and kitchen situation, or perhaps they had their own bathroom and kitchen in a home with many others. There were year-round apartments. Just various options for people and individuals who lived at a certain income level that didn't allow them to purchase or own their own home. And over the last 10 years, what I've seen is the transition to those opportunities being turned into things that we all know are short-term rentals, Airbnbs, vacation rentals. And that's really affected a segment of our population right in town that isn't able to then find some place to live and then work in the establishments right in our town. For example, we have what I thought when I first heard about this forum was, wouldn't it be great to invite someone who is experiencing the challenge of finding safe, affordable, accessible housing? And I was talking with some of the organizers about doing just that and had reached out preliminarily to some people that I had encountered over the last year. And across the board, the feeling that they had was shame over their situation and not wanting to come and talk about it in a public forum like this. And I thought, how sad that that's the overarching, of course, you know, they were interested to hear that there might be people interested in helping this situation, but they didn't want to name it for themselves. And over the last year, 2 years, many of the calls I received were individuals in our community who had established careers, had been long-term renters, and all of a sudden their housing was being sold because the market was in such a place that legitimately people who owned the home wanted to sell and make that profit and capitalize on that. But that was displacing individuals. I remember one call from a nurse who had been in her home for 20 years renting, great relationship with her landlord. Everyone felt terrible, but that was the situation. And she wanted to stay in Kennebunk and contribute to the community, just as everyone did that I spoke with, but there were no options for her. I can't pass out an affordable housing list to her because she wouldn't qualify for the subsidized housing that's there, not that it was vacant or available in the first place. And I couldn't, you know, people are often calling me saying, do you have a list of landlords that rent? And no, I don't. We do not. And so that's really difficult. And that's what I've seen change a lot is the lack of those options for people, whether it be a shared room, whether it be a long-term rental for themselves, or even something affordable. I don't know if you all know the neighborhood in Kennebunk. I believe the subdivision's Coldwater Farms. It's out on 99. A lot of very modest single-family homes in a very large development. You might have thought of these as starter homes a long time ago. And what you might go see when you go through that neighborhood today are the changes. People adding on to the homes, they're much bigger. The price point is certainly not something I would classify as a starter home today. So that's another type of a change. And the last thing I'll say about the changes that I've seen are maybe the attitudes and understanding in the community of the need. I think it's coming, but with that change is going to come a lot of need for this type of conversation to get people there and understand that their town will look different, their piece of property will look, their neighborhood will look different. It's not a bad thing, you know, this is actually a great thing, but to get there, that's gonna take a lot of these types of conversations. And what I've seen over the last several years are sort of, you know, we were talking earlier, Tracy said, I have a home, what's the problem? The problem is just what I'm saying. You don't see it or hear it because people are afraid and ashamed to talk about the fact that they don't have that housing. And these are people who we may know, we may see in the grocery store, you see them at your school or your gym. They're just, you know, regular people in your community contributing in various ways. And so those stereotypes of maybe what affordable housing is and who might live there, or even terms like workforce housing can be detrimental to the understanding of what's needed and what we're lacking.
I do think it's really important to bring the people into the room that are experiencing this problem. And I would be extremely surprised if virtually everyone in this room doesn't know somebody that's experiencing this challenge in one way or another. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But so I'm going to tell a couple of client stories. I just think just so we can understand the breadth and depth of this. And I think if I was telling these stories, you know, a decade ago, they probably would have involved folks who might be unemployed or underemployed, maybe folks who are struggling with substance use disorder or behavioral health issues. That is still absolutely true. But now it's the depth. One of the things that has changed is the depth and breadth of people that are impacted by this. And so it is our colleagues at work, it is our friends and our neighbors in one way or another. So the first story is a young man who's gainfully employed, has been gainfully employed, and he lives in an efficiency apartment, and his landlord is selling the apartment to turn it into condos. Again, not an infrequent story. And so he's looking for an apartment. And what he's finding are rents of $1,800 a month or more, which makes up 50% of his income. And so I'll talk about that in a second as well. But so they're not affordable. He cannot afford to rent those apartments. So somebody who has has housing that he can afford, that's being transitioned to something else, he cannot afford to find a new apartment. Again, a single person who's employed. Second story, a woman, let's call her Pam. So Pam was married with 2 kids. Experienced a divorce, so they had to sell the home. In selling the home was actually, they weren't able to pull any equity out of the home. So she found herself in a position with 2 kids where she couldn't afford to find a place to live. So she ended up living in the car with her 2 kids. She had a job, but because of the unpredictability of caring for 2 kids when living in a car, she very quickly lost that job. So then she then is homeless without a job with 2 kids. And the key there was the lack of stability. Housing would have provided stability in a way that would have prevented her from losing her job. The third story is a senior that we worked with who, and this is a very common story, whose husband had recently passed away, and she was not able to, she was worried about her ability to keep up the home. It needed home repair. Her heating system was beginning to run down and not work. And so she was not going to be able to maintain the home that she had lived in for decades and be able to stay there. So again, it is our friends, it's our neighbors, our colleagues, it's people we know at our church. So that one of the things that has changed is just the breadth and depth of the problem. I think the nature of the problem is different as well. So we talked about the cause of the problem being the lack of units. One of the manifestations of that is that people is what's called is housing affordability. So even for folks that have housing, the housing burden is high. So typically you should be paying about 30% of your income on your housing costs, and that includes utilities and heat, et cetera. Right now in York County, the average is 50%. So people are spending 50% of their income on either rent or their other housing costs, mortgage housing costs. And so that's 20% of their income that they don't have to pay for food or clothing or glasses for their kids or whatever that might be. So that has changed. So that is an invisible part of this. And this is where I think everyone in this room probably knows somebody, they may not know this, that may be struggling to make ends meet because of the housing burden, increased housing burden. And then the last thing I'll mention just about the impact, how the impact has changed, is that what we don't see is that people who are housed are much more likely to have a stable job, have a stable job, to be healthy, to actually persist in education and get better education. All the things that make us, that are indicators of well-being, people who are housed are much more likely to have those. And in turn, our communities are much more likely to thrive. It's because people that are employed and are healthy and educated are much more likely to contribute to thriving communities. That, again, is another invisible part of this that we don't talk about a lot, is the impact on individuals and communities and the impact on thriving. The last thing I'll mention that we've seen that's different, and we're hearing this a lot from our staff, is, I'll talk about this in a minute, but the range of services we use in response to this issue are preventive services to try and keep folks in their homes, and then intervention services to help work with folks that are at risk of losing their homes and who are in crisis. Our staff's time now is spent almost entirely on intervention. We cannot get upstream and work on prevention because so many people are in crisis. So just the number of people that are in crisis has gone up so significantly. I'll stop there.
When you talk about the housing burden, can you explain what are the elements of that you're,
So that,
it's a term I'm not that.
Let me just repeat the question so it's recorded. Can you describe what you mean by the housing burden?
I have a loud voice, so I can't just yell. Can you all hear me if I do that?
Well, we will record this.
Okay, sorry. So that just is the percent of the housing burden is the percent of your income that you're spending on housing. And so the housing burden, the experts tell us, should be about 30%. And in York County, the average is 50%. And that is very true.
But I'm just saying, what are the elements?
Oh, I'm sorry. So that would be,
What has gone up that has made that burden?
actually, so 2 years ago, I would have said what's gone up are rent and mortgage. Now I would say what's gone up are rent and mortgage and electricity and heating costs.
That's what I.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that's, the story I heard the other day was, someone that works for one of the food pantries, and what are the major causes of folks coming in with that need? And primarily it's that their rents have gone up 30-40%, and therefore there's not enough left in the monthly budget to buy food. That's basically what it is. So it's not just people that are in unhoused situations, it's people that the spending on the housing needs are crowding out the other human needs that we all have. Great. And so the other thing that I wanted to make sure to have our panelists address today, super important, is, we're all here because we are concerned about our community and our ability to respond effectively to this issue. And these folks are going to be able to tell us what are the things that we can do and start to discuss and talk about to take action and improve the situation in our communities. So maybe we'll start with Carter this time and come back the other direction.
So let me just talk a little bit briefly about some of the things that we're doing, and then connect that to some things that everyone in this room can do. So I think what we all need to be doing is thinking about how do we develop more units, right? The fundamental part of the challenge here is that there are not enough affordable housing units. And so we will talk more about that. So what I really wanted to spend my time talking about are what are the other things that we can be doing to help folks that either are at risk of losing their housing or are losing their housing. So we run a range of programs that help with that. And this is, I think, helpful. One thing that you can do is take this with you and maybe pass this information on to folks you may know who are struggling with this issue. So we run programs that are related to what I call bricks and mortar. So these are programs that would help the senior I mentioned, people who are in their homes, who the homes around them are no longer keeping them warm, safe, and dry. So we run weatherization programs, home repair programs, central heating assistance improvement programs, a whole range of programs focused on the home itself. We also run a range of programs that are focused on helping people stretch their dollars as far as they possibly can. So these would be programs like HEAP, or a heating assistance program, which you may have heard about because that's something that a lot of people are applying for this time of year, where we can help pay heating bills. We run a program that helps people fill out their tax returns so that they can take advantage of tax credits, which many people qualify for, including the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is actually one of the largest anti-poverty programs in the country. So programs that will put money into the pockets of people so that they can pay their rent, pay their mortgage, pay for food, help their dollars stretch as far as they can go. That also includes programs like transportation, where we help people in a low-cost way get to food, get to work, get to their source of education, to keep their other costs down. We also run a range of programs that are focused. So things that you can do. I'll mention this as I go along. For example, the tax preparation program that we run, that I mentioned, is staffed entirely by volunteers. We have volunteer tax preparers who work with folks. We have it's a really engaging volunteer opportunity. People really enjoy it, and you really are making a difference in people's lives when they get a return and put money in their pocket. We run a series of programs related to educating folks around how they can stretch their dollars. So these might be budgeting programs. They might be programs for first-time home buyers to understand, what can I really afford? What is this going to look like, and what can I afford? And first-time homeowners, and once I'm in my home, how can I make sure that I can continue to stay there? So those are the prevention-oriented programs that we run. We also then run intervention-oriented programs for folks that are at risk of losing their homes. We have a foreclosure prevention program. So if somebody's at risk of losing their home for foreclosure, this program is not nearly as big as it needs to be because of funding constraints, but we helped over 100 people last year keep their homes that were at risk of foreclosure. And then we also run programs for folks that, housing stability program, for example, that will help counsel folks that might be in a dispute with their landlord and at risk of eviction. Our health center that I mentioned focuses on folks who are homeless or in affordable housing, so make sure that folks can maintain their health. And then lastly, we run a series of programs that are focused on folks that are actually homeless. So they're new this year is the Maine State Housing is trying to better coordinate programs in the community that are focused on homelessness. And so we run what's called a homeless prevention hub, and that coordinates services across the county that are focused on folks who are homeless. So from prevention to intervention, and I think it's important to mention all of that because we tend to focus on the units, when I think we also need to be focusing on how do we keep people who are housed in their house, warm, safe, and dry, to not make the problem worse. In terms of things that you can do, I strongly encourage you to look for volunteer opportunities. For example, the shelter, we have Clay Gabriel here from the shelter. We have volunteer opportunities as well, delivering Meals on Wheels at Southern Maine Agency. There are a range of volunteer programs that you can work with that are programs directly related to helping people remain housed. Also, I think doing what you're doing today, being engaged in this issue, understanding the issue, and understanding that this is not a problem that is happening to somebody else somewhere else. This is happening in our own communities. What can we be doing in our communities in an innovative way to create housing for our neighbors and friends, for the people who are serving us coffee when we go get a cup of coffee, for the people that are teaching our kids, and that are answering our fire or police calls? What can we be doing in our communities? And the root of that is understanding the issue so that we can understand the policy solutions we need to implement to address it.
I think you're going to hear a common theme here, which is that I love what Carter said, is we all know someone who is affected by this issue. Even if you think you don't know someone, it's very safe to go ahead and assume you do. Just what I spoke about earlier, the shame of people not wanting to talk about it with others and not wanting to feel like they can't solve their own problems, one of the most basic of which is providing yourself shelter or your family shelter. So with that understanding and that thought that we all know someone who's affected by housing issues, is to then think about, what that means. Sometimes when things are very visible, it's easy to understand, what you see. Someone may be in the median with a sign, looking for some help and saying what's going on for them, and whether or not we make a decision right there to help. For that person, there's likely a lot going on, and there are several examples I can think of. When Carter mentioned heating programs, that's a huge burden, especially on older adults. And just this year, through the town, have helped several households obtain assistance with heating in one way or another, whether it's providing fuel, whether it's providing repairs, connecting them with repairs, just access to understanding how to keep themselves warm throughout the day, something very basic. And how we do that is we lean on our partners. York County Community Action has been part of that, but so have our local partners. If you're not familiar with Community Outreach Services or Community Harvest, some of our very local partners are part of how we go about helping people either remain in housing, obtain housing. There are individuals sleeping in their car in Kennebunk right now. Why? There are lots of reasons why. How do we help them? Lots of ways to help too. We lean on our community partners. We look for those supports. So those have to be supported. That's all the way from the top with your local leaders in your community, your town managers, your select board members, elected officials, even committees. Here in Kennebunk, here we're in Kennebunkport, but in Kennebunk, our planning board is currently workshopping their way through zoning changes based on the legislation passed LD 2003. And it's not been easy, but they held a public hearing last week. 20 members of our community showed up. That's important. It's important to have the discussion, to hear from people who may have concerns and wonder, what's that going to mean for my community? What's that going to mean for my backyard? And just yesterday, I spoke with an individual who is a little bit concerned about some development happening in his backyard. Not necessarily opposed to change in general, but what that means for him. And that's part of what we all have to become familiar with. Changes are going to come in terms of how your neighborhood looks, but what does that bring you? We were talking earlier about the diversity that's welcomed in a community when you have housing options and various choices, and how rich that makes your town and the place where you live and work and like to enjoy your life. So this drills down really specifically to all of us in terms of action items as well. Our planning board recently heard, in talking about LD 2003 and those changes, and they had recently heard about a proposal for affordable development in an area of town that may not be as familiar with very dense housing like that. And they were struggling with issues of what might that mean in terms of a burden on the town for services or supports. And some of the thinking that needs to be brought forward by people like yourselves in this room or others in the community is sort of addressing that the way things have always been doesn't mean that's the way they always have to be. And so one of the major concerns was with LD 2003, there's a reduced parking requirement for units. So people are worried, well, if we don't have a parking spot for every individual in the household, where will they all park? Well, they may not even have a car. And do we provide transportation services? Do we have other assistance programs in town? And in Kennebunk, which also serves the towns of Kennebunkport and Arundel, there is a volunteer driver transportation program that's getting off the ground. And started back in July, and it's you all. There's a driver in our room here today for that program, and it's wonderful. I'm sure she could speak all about it if you want to grab her ear after, but that's what you're doing, is you're helping people live comfortably in their homes, age in their homes. Also, they're going to work. They're going to volunteer in your community. They're making these contributions. And that's who these people are, that are affected by housing and that need different options and need support. So there are lots of action items in terms of what you personally can do. Some of it's just awareness, understanding the issue, hearing it, making sure your town and your town leaders are aware of it. Carter mentioned Meals on Wheels. We have some of our community leaders going out to deliver those meals next week, to see the volunteers who go and do that, to meet the recipients, to understand how that works in your community, and to bring that back to the decision-making level where policy can be created that supports that. It can be a fight in some towns to support some of these community services and supports, but that's what it's doing, is it's trickling down and it's running up. It's going up and down, and anyone who wants to talk about being a volunteer driver, I'll be around after.
Can I say one more thing? Just a second. I meant to say this when I was talking about the range of services and supports we provide. One thing you can do is, it is very difficult for folks to ask for help. And that is particularly true in Maine. Mainers are very stubborn. And so if it's not me asking for help tomorrow, it might be me asking for help another day. So if you do know folks who need help, please encourage them to feel comfortable calling us. And we have folks who won't call for heating assistance because they think that means somebody else who might need it more is not going to get it. That is not true. Those are the types of things. So if people can, if you can encourage folks to be comfortable reaching out for a helping hand, knowing that another day they might be providing a helping hand to somebody else.
Really well said, both of you. And I think for me, the change that we can help to foster is that idea of thinking about the challenge, but also the opportunity. And I remember when we moved to Kennebunkport 15 years ago, and the community has changed since then, right? The mix of incomes and people that used to live in our community used to be very different. And that I have felt that, one of the reasons I ran for office is I felt that as a loss. And to have that diversity of people and incomes and jobs and all of that good stuff is a positive for communities. And I think that all of us here, I hope, share an interest in making sure that our communities preserve and grow and keep that as part of who we are. So I would encourage everyone to weigh in on that. And I will say, from the perspective of the legislature, so the local issues and the local folks that are doing so many amazing things to help people in these challenging situations, we're trying at the state level to do our part and play the role. So one of the main things that we passed very quickly in this legislative session was the emergency heating relief checks that went out, the $450 checks that went out to everyone most people in Maine, most adults in Maine, to really help people with the cost of heating during the winter months. So that was one of the first things. On the select committee, one of the main areas that we're focused on right now is something called the housing first approach. So for those folks who are out in the cold, who have experienced persistent and long-term homelessness, it's an approach that basically puts them in housing first, without conditions, without a checklist of things you need to do on a constant basis in order to keep your housing, or you get kicked out. And so these are some folks that have been in and out of multiple different shelter kinds of situations, and they're living in tents, and they are really challenged personally with it could be a very wide range of different personal situations. And the idea here is that they deserve a safe and warm place to live. And so this approach makes sure, number one, that the units are available. So we have programs that build and construct these kinds of apartment buildings. Basically, it's just an apartment building with a community room and appropriate places for people to enter and exit. But then the main thing is to have the wraparound services, 24/7 services. So you have two people on staff all the time that can deal with issues that come up, that can help people who are needing someone to talk to at 2 in the morning because they're isolating. All of those kinds of services are very successful. and helping people in these situations to be safe and be in a stable housing environment for the long term. And when I put on my dollars and cents hat, the numbers are compelling as well, because these are the folks that might spend, one gentleman was in the emergency room in Portland 90 times in 1 year. So, when you start looking at the average cost that this is burdening our systems with, they also these are folks that have frequent interactions with law enforcement. So they're often in jail simply because there's nowhere else to take them. And so I think that, just being realistic about the kinds of challenges that people are dealing with, when you look at the all-in cost, it's a much lower cost to just keep that person in a safe environment where they have the help that they need. So that's something that we're working on right now. The governor mentioned that in her State of the Budget address as as a bill that she would sign when it comes to her desk. So that is job one on the Housing Committee. We are working on that bill and meeting with a lot of folks. We visited yesterday Houston Commons, which is an Avesta-owned Housing First project that's been in existence for 6 years in Portland. So we were there yesterday, and it was very, very encouraging to see that kind of a program in action. So those are the two things I wanted to mention. So I would say, learn about these things in terms of what you can do, and help people understand that this is something that we need to address in order to tackle the most unhoused portion of the population, of our population, our people. So I'm going to open it up for questions. We have some time left, and we're going to start over here with Representative Dan Sayer.
Thank you, Tracy. As Tracy mentioned, I'm a representative for the rest of Kennebunk, also Kennebunk. And I had the experience in running for office on knocking. Thank you. I had the experience of knocking on an awful lot of new doors. So for folks who are, Kennebunk has seen tremendous development of housing, but it's not the housing that meets the need of everyday Mainers. And that's really when, Karen, I had two things a simple question and then a longer question. The simple question is, you mentioned the $450 checks, or Tracy mentioned the $450 checks. And those are a lifeline to an awful lot of us. They're not a lifeline for some of us. And I wanted to ask you, Karen, if I had a $450 check that I wanted to donate to deal with the problems that you were articulating, who would I make that check out to?
Okay, there are several places you can make the check out to. Some of the things that we're talking about when you talk about housing, it's not just the home, it's not just the roof over your head, it's everything you need to stay in that place. And Carter's spoken about that a lot, but some of the barriers for people remaining in housing or being able to afford their housing are things like being able to afford their food, being able to afford a trip to work or the doctor. There are several studies, so I'm not going to quote any one of them, but many studies have found that for the average household, there is not any sort of safety net savings able to accommodate a typical emergency in someone's life. You go to have your car inspected and you need 4 new tires, anywhere from $600 to $1,000. The average household does not have that in their savings account to accommodate that. So what happens when they have to spend $1,000 to keep tires on their car, to get to work, to get to the doctor, to maintain their lives? It comes from somewhere else. Maybe they're not able to afford the heat that they have to put in their tank, or they can't afford clothing or food, or their electric bill. Something has to give to accommodate for that emergency that's come up for them that is an emergency. So the outside supports that we've been talking about, in my opinion, would be a great place to add that extra income that you may have that you personally don't need. People need help with food. We have a food pantry that serves the 3 towns in this area. Good Shepherd Food Bank. There's many across the state you can find. Heating assistance. York County Community Action offers that, but local towns have emergency heating assistance programs, and we need these. We need the variety of those options. They're for different times and different reasons. Individuals have to qualify for these programs. That's paperwork, that's time and documentation. So while they're filling out that paperwork and documentation with an agency that can support them for a little bit longer, the town can come in and make an emergency delivery. So the town's fuel assistance program, we have lots of nonprofit organizations on our website that the town supports through the municipal budget program as well, that give these supports for various things: transportation, food, heat. Those are three major ones. You think about your basic expenses, where you spend your money, and typically those are great places that will help people across the board. Your second question?
And Carter, did you want to wait?
I'm reluctant to mention this, both because it sounds self-serving, and also because it's a very finite resource. But we have something called our Hope Fund, which does exactly what you just described. So someone knocks on our door, says, I'm struggling because I have to get a car repair. If I don't get my car repaired, I will not be able to get to work. I'll lose my job. I'll lose my housing, which is exactly what happens. And so we have something called the Hope Fund, which is a very finite resource where we can help pay for those things. I'm reluctant to mention it because that is not the type of funding that funders like to provide. Most funding comes with very strict limitations, and it's not discretionary like that. So, but that is funded by contributions from individuals.
Next question. Superintendent.
I'm going to stand up and use the mic. This is my Oprah moment. So I have to say this, and this was not planned. We were talking about our personal stories, and I have to speak to you from the lens of being a superintendent and coming from outside of the state. So when I came in 2020 in August, that was the end of the summer and things were still very high and people were renting at summer rates. I had absolutely nowhere to go. I stayed in Portland and in the Doubletree Hotel for about 2 months, and I floundered for a year and a half, moving from hotel to, I knew nothing about a summer rental or winter rental and all of that. That was foreign to me for a year and a half. And during the summer of 21, I spent, as a superintendent, $12,000 for about 7 weeks staying in hotels in Portland. Because this week it was this rate, you move somewhere else, it was a lower rate, then it was a higher rate. And it was a situation where my husband and I had to look and say, is this really going to be worth it? It is $12,000 for 7.5, 8 weeks to find a place to stay. It was not stable at all. And it wasn't until I moved into a location where the landlord said, Terry, look, I don't want to come out of Boston every week having to, clean up and have new renters. As long as you're here, you can stay in this house. And so it has been stable for over a year. But as we're looking at bringing in more people from outside of our community, outside of our state, if we can offer them a job, but if they cannot find stable housing, then they're not going to come. And it becomes a robbing Paul to pay Peter. So we're getting teachers from Biddeford, we're getting teachers from Massabesic, or we're getting teachers from this place and the other. And so we put them at a disadvantage as well. So housing has to be available. I will also say this. We have offered contracts to teachers outside of the state, and we have just partnered with this organization, Global Educational Center, where we're bringing in international teachers, and it serves several purposes. One, we want to increase the diversity in our schools. That has been one of the goals of the district, and I want to make sure that we adhere to that. So we're going to bring in high quality teachers. So we've interviewed some teachers. We haven't committed to anything at this point. But my question is going to be, where are they going to stay? Mm-hmm. So I've said to board members, listen, can you host them in your house? Can we find people who will host them until we can provide stable housing? And is that the way you really bring in people? You're living in someone's, extra spare bedroom, or students off from college. You can stay here for a few months, but then you're on your own. So one of the things, and I've been in conversation with a lot of different people, because we have two challenges here, two distinct challenges. One, affordable housing, and then available housing. Two distinct. People may be able to afford it, may not be the price they want to pay, but you don't even have them available for people. the school system has property, right? We do have some property. And I've been in talks, and I don't know if I can say whom I've been in talks with. She's sitting in the back, smiling at me, and just happens to be the town manager of Kennebunk. I'm not calling any names or anything like that. And I have been talking to a lot of people. If we have the property, if we can put our minds together, our money together, apply for grants, why can we not develop units on that property where we can support? And initially, I was thinking about educators. It may not be permanent dwelling. It could be, stay here for a year until you can find something. We can build something in the community, what have you. And then as I was talking to this town manager who lives in Kennebunk, who is the town manager for Kennebunk in the back, she said, listen, what about some other service providers? So what about our officers? Because I know we just hired an officer outside of the state of Maine. I don't know where that person is living. That person may have housing. I don't know. What about healthcare workers? If you don't have educators, if you don't have healthcare workers, if you don't have law enforcement or social services in your district, then we have a problem. We can't keep you safe, we can't educate you, and we can't keep you healthy. Okay, there is a problem. So building something that would allow people from outside the community, outside the state, outside the country to come in and have a stable place to live and work, which creates a robust community, that's where we need to put our energy and effort. I think we have to think totally outside of the box when it comes to this. And I am willing to talk with anyone, in addition to the town manager of Kennebunk, about how we can make this happen and it not just be a conversation. We have to put our mouth and actions to work. So this is not the Terry Cooper Show. I will turn it over.
I think we might want to make it the Terry Cooper Show, because that's amazing, yes. Yes.
Yeah, we love the Terry Cooper Show. We're going to tune in next week. Hi, I'm Rachel Phipps, and I'm a long time resident of Kennebunk, but I've also lived in Arundel, and I've lived in Kennebunkport. And a few things I want to say. I don't think we need any more indication of how deep this crisis is. I think we've done a good job of explaining that, but I do want to say that I just, within the last 2 weeks, went on to the MIT Livable Wage Calculator for York County, and you can do it for anywhere in the country. The livable wage right now for York County is, if you're one adult with 3 children, you need to be making $68 an hour. If you are 2 adults with 3 children, you need to be making, each adult needs to be making $33 an hour. That is the livable wage calculator for York County in 2023. I think we can probably understand that that's not happening for very many people here. I also want to say, I think as we're talking about, getting out of our old habits, we really need to be talking about regulation and regionalization. Again, I've been here for 30 plus years, and I have been on a Kennebunk Affordable Housing Committee, and then a Kennebunkport Affordable Housing Committee. And we need to regionalize this effort. We can't, the sort of the old home rule, we need to regionalize our efforts because, when you're unhoused, you don't really know those boundaries, right? You kind of put your car anywhere it can be, right? So we really need to, and we need to regulate. We need to regulate the short-term rentals. I currently work for Head Start in Cumberland County, and we have a staff of about 70, and we had 4 male people in our staff. Again, diversity. They brought wonderful, diversity to our early childhood experience, and 3 of them have had to move and leave our program because they lost their housing. They couldn't afford to move anywhere else. We've also just lost a teacher. We are absolutely desperate for teachers, and we just lost her. She put in her notice today or this week because she cannot afford to find a place to live that she can afford on a Head Start salary. Just speaking of in our very own community, my mother, many of you out there know her, she's at River Ridge right now in rehab. They are so understaffed. They have visiting nurses from Mississippi, and my mom pulled her cord, and it took 50 minutes for someone to get to her room. We're thinking about, we don't feel like she's safe there. We feel like bringing her home because we feel like she's safer at home than in a facility that's understaffed. That's a facility in Kennebunk. And very last, because it's not the Rachel Phipps show either, I want to just say that the housing crisis, I'm glad you brought up starting in the 80s, but I would have to say it really started, at least 100 years ago with the restrictions. The government imposed restrictions based on racism. So we are dealing with the impacts of white supremacy and racism that has now become an absolute crisis. And for people, I would highly, highly recommend the book, The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee, to really understand the crises that we're dealing with in all of our systems, our healthcare systems, our housing system, our early childhood system, our how do we take care of our elder system. Why don't we have things like that in this country? Read The Sum of Us, because it will explain it in the most understandable way, and I think it will transform, it's certainly transformed my sense of history and how we got here.
Great. Clay, I think is next.
Hi, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Clay Graybeal. I'm president of the board for York County Shelter Programs, and we are currently rebranding ourselves because there's two misunderstandings about York County Shelter, which is one, that it's a program of the county, which it isn't. It's located here. And the other is our notion of shelter, which is, I think most of us think of, that means a couple of weeks. But we house over 400 people in permanent housing all through the county. We have buildings in almost every town, I think. And so one of the things, the other part is our shelter. We shelter temporarily 37 people in the adult shelter and about a couple of dozen in the family shelter. But we're full right now, and we're always full. One of the things we've sort of committed to doing, though, is never turning anybody down. So we are creatively putting people in all kinds of spaces. But just want folks to know, and this is a challenge, as we've heard before, there are so many folks who are full-time employed in good jobs and have lost their home. And we get calls from them every day. But nevertheless, I still want you to know about York County Shelter Programs, because you can still call if you know someone in need, and we'll do everything we can to get them resources and give them a warm place to stay until they can get permanent housing.
Great, thank you. Okay, Tanya?
I feel like I've been spoken about a little bit today. So my name is Tanya Alsberg. I live in affordable housing here in Kennebunkport, that was built by the Kennebunkport Heritage Housing Trust. At the beginning of the pandemic, my landlord in Kennebunk raised the rent considerably and informed us that he would be raising it again in a few months, and we couldn't afford that. So we had very insecure housing for almost 2 years. The Kennebunkport Heritage Housing Trust showed up at the right time for us, and we fit in all the requirements, and somehow we got selected for one of the first 6 homes. And now we own a home here in town, and we aren't in debt doing it. And that's a kind of an amazing thing. So to tell you a little bit about why we fit the bill for that and why it might matter that we're here in your community, my wife and I own a shop, Jack Designs, on Dock Square. Jack is her initials. When we started the business 25 years ago, we decided Jack sounded better than Jaka, so it's her monogram. In our shop, we sell the work that we make. We're fiber artists, and we make knitwear, we make clothing. And what we sell in our shop are the artisan-made things here, made in Maine. And that's what tourists come to Maine for, just in case you weren't sure. I meet them all the time, and that's what they're excited to see, is something they don't see everywhere else. We sell our work. We buy work from other Maine and regional artists, and that's what we sell there. So our shop is unique. It's special, and that is truly what people come here for. They tell us all the time they're so excited to have walked into a shop where they're not seeing what they saw every other town and every other shop. So that's one thing. Also, it's cool stuff. The other thing is, as community members, we're your neighbors, and Jen and I and our business and our lives are committed to social and environmental justice, and those are our concerns. That's what matters to us. When we lived in Kennebunk, Jen was on the Energy Efficiency Committee. I volunteered for the school board. We, right now, live in Kennebunkport. Jen is on the Climate Action Planning Committee. I volunteer for the connector and drive lots of your neighbors around. We are a part of the community. We want to be a part of the community, but when we lost our housing in Kennebunk and started looking around for somewhere to live, our search kept getting further and further and further away and looked worse and worse and worse. And we reached a point where it was looking like we were gonna have to close our shop here and move away, because our idea of living here in this community was not to commute for an hour or two. It was to be here. And now we are able to do that because, again, of the Kennebunkport Heritage Housing Trust, which is planning to build a lot more housing for neighbors like me. And I really hope that that is something that you all can support and continue working towards, because yeah, I mean, I hope I've made my case for why we should be your neighbors, but just in case I haven't, my other neighbors are pretty fantastic too. Thanks.
Thanks, Tanya.
I have what I hope is a good segue to that. I've been concerned for a long time that affordable housing, according to the state, has to remain affordable for 25 years. Now that's just one, is that still right? 45. 45, are you sure it's 45? Okay. It used to be 25. That was when I was a reporter at the York County Co-Star. It was only 25. 45 is better, but you know, it's still not enough. What happens? I've lived here about 45 years. So all of a sudden I'm like, oh, I can now sell this, what was affordable for me, for, you know, big bucks from somebody from New York, because I've been here 45 years. I think I would propose to the state that affordable housing needs to remain affordable in perpetuity. And I don't see why that can't be. So if you have the advantage of buying an affordable home, that advantage, you know, which could go up by inflation or something like that, would also remain for other people in the future who buy that home. So that's my idea for the state.
Thank you. Yes.
I'm Marilyn Wentworth, and I work with an organization called Welcoming Immigrants, Our New Neighbors. And we work primarily with people, with immigrants in Biddeford. And one of the things that's happened for me from working with those people is I have learned we don't even go to Kennebunk to look for anything for anybody to live. It is simply not possible. And it is brought home to me that all of us in this room pretty much are people of real privilege. And it seems to me that one of the things I've come to recognize is that we have to change our attitudes a little. We have to think about what we could go without so somebody else could have something. And some of us live in houses that are 2,000 square feet. There could be another apartment in our house if the town makes it possible for us to do that. Because right now, I know two people that I know quite well who had spaces they could rent, and they did, for prices that I could never in my life afford. And they are not people who need money. So I sit here thinking, we need a change of attitude. If I have a place that I can rent, I don't need to rent it for what the market will allow. I could rent it so that somebody could have a place to live. And I really think that we need to have a change in the way we think, those of us who have great privilege. Because if you go to Biddeford and you see some of these people, I'm working with a family right now, a mother who walked from Honduras to the Mexican-American border carrying a 2-year-old child with a 5 and a 6-year-old. And don't we want people here with that kind of persistence and that kind of courage? And she has no place to live. She's living in a motel right now. So, you know, I think it's not just all the services that are provided that are wonderful. It's us too. It's us and what we can give and how we can change the way we think we have to live. It's easier to have an Airbnb space in your house and make a lot of money than to make that space available to somebody who needs housing. So I think we need to encourage our friends. You know, if you got a friend who has a great big house, say, why don't you put an apartment upstairs? I think we can do a lot more than we do just ourselves because we have plenty of privilege.
Thanks, Marilyn. Yes, in the back, with you.
Come up here for the microphone. My name is Leslie Steffler, and I am with the Kennebunk Rotary Club. I am also a new resident to Maine. We have lived here now for 14 months, and we are from away. However, we are not unfamiliar with living in a community environment like this. So my question for the panel and for all of us is I hear, and I've heard this in the community we came from, lots of organizations trying to do lots of things. As a person who needs help, where is my central location, my central website, my telephone number that will refer me to those places that can help me? And then number two, where can we look to create on a state level a public-private partnership? It's great that there are developers in town that will, or developers in the state that will do affordable apartments, but we all know the stigma attached to that. I've been in housing for 46 years, and I have managed HUD programs, I've managed state programs, and if they are well managed, they're excellent. If they are not well managed, they're a disaster. And so my question would be, are there public-private relationships, tax incentives for developers, tax incentives for individuals? Because I think to ladies who just, Marilyn's question, who just brought this up, you know, if I can't get an apartment in my house zoned, doesn't matter what my, you know, if I can't get an attached dwelling unit, and if you can't have people come together and say, hey, let's create these smaller communities, smaller footprints, cooperative housing.
Great question. Thanks very much. And I will take the second part of your question first. Since you're, Leslie, since you're new to the state, in the last legislature, we passed LD 2003, which is going into effect now. And that, the two main things that that law did is to allow accessory dwelling units any place where single family zoning exists. So basically, if you own a single family zone and you, single family home and you have room on your lot to build something or to build an interior apartment, you can do it. There's no extra approval. You don't need to go before the planning, but you can just do it. You need to get the building permit and get approved, and then that happens. It also allows on a single family zoned lot the ability to, again, without any special approval, to construct up to a duplex. So that is going into existence right now. It's in rulemaking with the Department of Economic and Community Development at the state. And then there was just an article, Karen and I were just talking about Kennebunk's steps to actually implement, and every municipality is going through to update their ordinances to make sure that those are reflected. There's a whole conversation we can have about all of the other things that are encouraging in that particular law to encourage higher density development. And I say that word density intentionally because we all need to take a breath and accept that word and embrace that word. Because what that means, what density means, is if I'm an older person looking to downsize from my large house that could then become available to a family, that means that I might be able to live in an easy single-story apartment with other people, so I can go to book club and knitting club and card games and that sort of thing in a way where I don't need to shovel snow and I don't need to cut my lawn. And that is an example of higher density. It is thinking about accepting and being open to different styles of housing that honestly better meet the needs of today's people. If you're a retiree, if you're a young person, a large single-family house on 2 acres might not be what you need, and to be open. So I just encourage, to go down to what Marilyn said, to just be open to thinking about other ways to do things. And then the second piece, I'm going to hand off for your first question, Leslie, to
Yeah, great questions. One thing you may or may not be familiar with is a saying called "nothing for the people without the people." And it's a very poverty-informed type of an approach to always include the individuals you're looking to help in the solution. And when you're looking for maybe one central place to send people and say, how do we organize all these resources? What I've personally heard from people looking for those resources are they don't want a wrong door. No matter where they go looking for help, there should be no wrong door to enter. So that's the work that we all need to do, is inform each other about the services so that when someone calls someone, no matter who it is, they're connected with the resources they need. So you can look to your town to say, well, maybe it's the town's responsibility. You can look to your CAP agency or your shelter or other organizations, but actually what people need is no wrong door. They need to be greeted where they enter and provided those resources where they enter. So that's the work we all have to really do, is to meet them where they are. And just one thing to piggyback, if I can, on that second question, is to think about some of the other things mentioned, regional approaches to some of these issues. We need to be open and supportive of some of these out-of-the-box ideas. For example, when you think about opening your home to another person, you might think, well, there are lots of reasons why I wouldn't want to do that. That's scary. Some great and wonderful programs are happening right in our area that support people wanting to do that. So they can be organized at your local level from the town if you have the capacity to support that, or they can be outside organizations. But there are incentive programs for people to rent year-round, for example, to landlords, to provide security deposit assistance, to provide services and support to the individuals who may encounter a problem with their rent, so it doesn't get to an eviction process. And shared housing, just all these sorority houses. There's one in Portland I just learned about, so a sorority house for women above the age of 60 or something. Sounds wonderful. Sign me up. You have a live-in. Yeah, well, you have a live-in house mom, and different supports available. So there are lots of ways we could address this housing issue. We have to be willing to think about them and accept them. And great questions.
Can I just add, the programs and services in York County and the municipalities in York County are very well coordinated on the ground. So we do a very strong no wrong door process. I'll also say there is something called 211. Which is a centralized resource. So if folks in this room or otherwise are not sure where to go or which door to even knock on, you can call 211 and they have a central repository of information about all the programs and services.
Thanks both, and thanks for reminding everyone about, including me, about 211. That's a great question. I did also want to add to Leslie's bigger question. This is fundamentally the work of the Joint Select Committee on Housing, right? To tackle the big, in addition to the short-term emergency stuff, the big picture structural issues that have evolved over a long period of time in Maine. And I will say this, and I will say this publicly. In Maine, we have state government and we have municipalities. And the challenge for all of our municipalities around the state, most of which are very small, it's very difficult with a small staff, and our towns do an amazing job. So I'm just going to preface anything I say. We have amazing people that work in all of the towns in our area and have the good fortune to be relatively well staffed. But many, many towns in Maine have a town clerk and a part-time receptionist. That's all they've got. So there's been nobody to tackle How do you planfully figure out where housing should go, how we can invest strategically in housing that's near shopping and services so people don't have to drive 50 miles every time you need something. And that's fundamentally what we're doing. And I will say, I will call on everyone in this room to participate and reach out to your friends around the state. It's a hard conversation in Maine, because people want everything to be decided at the municipal level, but we need to figure out from a regional perspective how to create the cooperation to say, let's plan together so that we can all have the people that we want to have and keep in our communities. I will say this, Maine's strategic economic plan states that we need 75,000 more people in Maine. I had a conversation with a Republican colleague the other day, and this is not a political thing, but it just so happens that he and I have talked about this, and he said, well, we just should get more people working in Maine. And I said, well, who would those folks be? And he said, well, all the people that don't go to work. And I said, again, who? So I pulled up the statistics. For people under the age of 65, the labor participation rate in Maine ranges from the lower ages, from, including people that are in college, from 70% up to 85%. For people over 65, it's 20%, because people are retiring. That's the issue. We have the oldest population in the country, and it's the fact that people are just getting older and retiring. That is the main issue. So we need to bring in people. In addition, our median age is 47. I don't know about you, but I don't know a lot of 47-year-olds who are going to start having babies. So, so when you look at the fundamental challenge, and I had a aha moment with this gentleman, because he was like, oh, we just need to bring in more people. Yeah. So back to the Biddeford conversation, I was meeting with the folks in Saco yesterday who are bringing in a lot of the asylum seekers who absolutely, Maryland, have spines of steel for what they have gone through. And do I want someone with a spine of steel who's going to contribute to our communities? Absolutely. And we asked the question, well, what are some of the skill sets that the people here are bringing there? In the Comfort Inn in Saco, there are 88 families, about 150 individuals, including the children. And I said, oh, they've got a real range of skills. There are many nurses who have certification in their countries, and they're already, once they get through their asylum application and their clock is done ticking and they can apply for their work permit, they are all looking to get into the CNA program so they can become CNAs and hopefully become nurses again. Oh, and there are a lot of electricians and plumbers, and every legislator in the room sat up and said, oh my gosh, I need that person in my house right now. So the idea that we need to have these conversations to say we need to be open to addressing the needs of people who can contribute in hugely valuable ways. The other statistic I will toss out to you, we are also working on migrating our economy to address climate change. We need 3,500 solar installers that we do not have. 3,500. Where are these folks going to come from? We need to be able to create places for people to live so they can join us and continue to make Maine the rich and growing and exciting place. And we need to do it in a smart way that is sustainable development, that creates real viable lives in the long term. So I know time, how are we doing on time? Are we way over? Okay, one more question, but really, really wonderful dialogue here. Yes.
Thank you, Tracy. So I'd just like to invite everyone to think about stigma, which has been mentioned here a couple of times today, because it's up to us to examine and shift and change stigma. It's not up to the people who need us to do that. It's up to each one of us. Marilyn, the people that you mentioned who could maybe have an apartment. Every one of us in this room has more than we need. I feel very, very certain of that. I know most of you. So I really invite you to think about stigma and what you can start doing, maybe at a cocktail party tonight. What's the conversation that you can bring up that will invite people to think differently and more deeply, and most importantly, more generously?
Thanks, Mary Louise. Great. I want to thank everyone for being here and for, again, starting the conversation. We could have a 3-hour conversation about many of the topics that were raised today, so I encourage everyone to stay engaged, stay connected, certainly reach out to our colleagues who are working in our community. I am available. You can find my information on the legislature website or reach out individually. And thanks, everyone, for being here and for all the folks who put together the wonderful program. Thank you, Sean and Amy and Tom. Oh, and some announcements from the floor. I'm going into legislative mode. Oh, Miriam. Oh my gosh. See, I forget. There you go. She told me and I forgot.
I know I'm looking at a whole room of people who are involved, so I just wanted to remind you all that the town of Kennebunkport, and Arundel are all looking for both school board members and select board members. Please consider doing it. And you just would go to your town clerk, you receive papers, you'd have to get 25 signatures, which is a piece of cake for this group, and have them in back to the town clerk by April 14th. Thank you.
Thank you. And on that note, thanks everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.